So we'll conclude our discussion on Chapter 4, the tissues, by looking very briefly at the muscular tissues and nervous tissue. We've got entire chapters devoted to both of these topics, so we'll only spend a little bit of time here. We'll spend a lot more time on both of these topics as we get to later chapters here. But we'll just get a little preview of them here. So let's begin with the muscular tissues. Now, the muscular tissues, or the function of all of the muscular tissues, is to produce movement by contraction, right? So that this term contraction means that the muscle is shortening in length, and in doing so, it's generating a pulling force. And so that is how muscles are able to produce movement, by contracting and shortening, generating these pulling forces and producing movement that way, right? Pretty similar to our epithelial tissues, we see that muscular tissues are highly cellular tissues. So there's really very little extracellular matrix that exists between muscular tissues. Really the primary thing that we're going to see within muscular tissues are the cells. These muscle cells are typically referred to as muscle fibers, and so we may use those two terms interchangeably. I know I will generally refer to them as muscle fibers, and so just be aware that if I'm using this term fiber, I'm talking about a muscle cell, right? So unlike the epithelial tissues, which are not vascularized at all, the muscular tissues are very well vascularized, and so these guys require, particular skeletal muscles as well as cardiac muscle, requires a pretty constant supply of oxygen and nutrients to make chemical fuel to generate those contractions. So particularly skeletal muscles need a lot of glucose or glycogen in order to make ATP so that we can continue to produce the contractions that move our body. So muscle tissues, as we'll see in the next slide here, we've got three types of muscle tissues, and those three types of muscle tissue are classified as either voluntary, which means that we have conscious control over them, or they are classified as involuntary. Now, involuntary muscle tissues are muscle tissues that we do not have conscious control over. So looking at the three types of muscular tissues, we have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is our voluntary muscle tissue type, so we have conscious control over movement of the skeleton and what we do and the movements that we produce. Cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary, so these two muscle tissue types are controlled automatically by our nervous system. Let's take a look at skeletal muscle first and some attributes of that. So skeletal muscle cells or fibers tend to be long and cylinder shaped. Sometimes they are so, in this example here with this photomicrograph image here of some cleared and stained muscle tissue, we see that the entire cell doesn't even fit into the image here. So we're only seeing part of one cell here, part of another cell here, another one here. And so these muscle fibers are so long that we can't actually see the entire cell in this microscope image here. Because of the large size of skeletal muscle cells, they are multinucleate, which means that they have more than one nucleus per cell. And so that's what you're seeing right here, is that these skeletal muscle fibers are so packed with the proteins that cause muscle contraction. So that's what you're seeing in these striations here. These are the proteins that are arranged in the skeletal muscle that aid in muscle contraction. The skeletal muscle fiber is so packed with those proteins that the nuclei of the cells are kind of pushed out to the periphery or to the sides here. So these little rod-shaped structures that you're seeing here are the nuclei of the skeletal muscle cells. I've already pointed out the visible striations here. So the striations are the regular arrangement of the proteins that cause contraction in the muscle cells. We'll look at those two proteins in much greater detail in chapter 9 when we get to physiology of the skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles function to move not only the skeleton but the skin as well. So there are some skeletal muscles that attach to our skin and produce, like in our face, to produce movements of the face and create facial expressions as a way of nonverbal communication there. So finishing up with skeletal muscle, we'll take a look at cardiac muscle here. So probably unsurprisingly, cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. It's a much smaller muscle cell type, so there's only one nucleus per cell. We have visible striations within the cardiac muscle cell, although the striations aren't as clean as skeletal muscles because the arrangement of the proteins that cause their contraction it's not as cleanly organized, we will say, as the organization of the proteins within the skeletal muscle. And so we get visible striations, but they're not as clean looking as we saw in skeletal muscles. What you can't see in this, maybe you can in this diagram here, particularly with this cell right here, or this fiber right here, is that the fiber, it tends to be branched a little bit. And the branched cardiac muscle cells are all connected with one another by these structures called intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs help attach the cardiac muscle cells together one another so that they can behave essentially as one electrical unit. And so this means that electrical impulses that are traveling through the heart muscle can travel through all of the cells of the heart muscle and make the different parts of the heart contract simultaneously. And so these intercalated discs help to provide not only physical attachment so that the cells are bound tightly to one another so they're not pulled apart from one another. The intercalated discs also contain structures that allow the passage of electrical signals from one muscle cell to the next. And so that helps all of the cardiac muscle cells behave as one single electrical unit. So of course, muscle tissue's job is to produce movement by contraction, and so the contractions of cardiac muscle function to pump blood through the cardiovascular system, that is through the heart and also through the arteries and veins as well. Last but not least, here we'll take a look at smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle is primarily found in the walls of hollow organs, so think like the walls of the digestive system, so like the stomach, the intestines, and things like that. The walls of structures in the urinary system, like the urinary bladder, the uterus as well, in the female reproductive system. And smooth muscle is also found aligning the walls of blood vessels as well. We see that smooth muscle is a small muscle cell, just like we saw with cardiac muscle. It's called smooth muscle because we don't see any visible striations within the light micrographs of our smooth muscle cells. They do have those same contractile proteins that are within them that skeletal and cardiac muscle have, but they're just not as regularly arranged, and so we don't get those nice visible striations like we see in skeletal and cardiac muscle. The cells are thin and kind of thread-like, and give them kind of a more thread-like appearance. And so they really kind of, I think smooth muscle kind of looks more like a sheet of epithelial tissue than it does like a muscular tissue. So just be careful not to confuse this one with some of the epithelial tissues, and you'll be okay. So that does it for the muscular tissues. Let's briefly take a look at nervous tissue here as we wrap up chapter 4. Nervous tissue is the main component of things like the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. So basically all of the structures of the nervous system will contain nervous tissue. The nervous system's tissue as a whole has the function of regulating and controlling body functions. So this was one of the two organ systems that controlled homeostasis. We see that the nervous tissue is made primarily of two cell types. We have these star-shaped neurons, which tend to be quite large in comparison to these really small cells called neuroglia. So these are two primary cell types of the nervous system. Now these star-shaped neurons are the highly specialized cells that send signals, right? So these are the signaling cells. The neuroglia function in other capacities like supporting, protecting, and insulating the neurons. So let's briefly take a look at neuron structure. We'll come back to this in chapter 11 when we get to physiology of the nervous system, but we'll get a little primer of the nervous system structure here so that that way we get a chapter 11 with nervous system physiology. It'll be a little bit more familiar to you. So let's look at basic kind of neuron structure here. So we'll start here at the right side. We'll look at the neuron soma. So the neuron the neuron soma is the cell body of the neuron, as this word soma just means body. It contains the nucleus and the other organelles like the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, all of that. So it contains the usual complement of organelles that we see in other tissues, or I should say, sorry, in other cells here. And these organelles carry out the exact same functions for neurons that we see in other cells. So the endoplasmic reticulum functions to make proteins and lipids. The mitochondria function to make ATP. So we're seeing the same functions being carried out by those organelles as we see in other cells. So we've got the neuron soma there, which houses the nucleus and the other organelles. And then we have a number of branch-like processes that come off of that neuron soma. So the more numerous of the branch-like processes that we see here are the dendrites. And the dendrites are the receptive endings of the neurons. That is, the dendrites are sensitive to stimuli. So these are really the stimulus detectors in the neurons here. Longer, less numerous processes that we see here are structures called axons. Now, the axon is a single long process that extends from the neuron soma, and so neurons generally only have one axon. And the axon's function is to create electrical impulses that travel from essentially the part of the axon nearest to the soma. They travel down the axon towards these axon terminals here. And these electrical impulses are called action potentials. And so we see that the axon creates action potentials. Finally, the axon terminals here are the branched ends of the axon here. Their job is to store chemicals called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are the chemicals that signal other nearby cells. So generally, another cell will be in close proximity to these axon terminals here. When those neurotransmitters are released, we see that those neurotransmitters will signal nearby cells. These neurotransmitters are released by action potentials, and we'll see that how that whole process works when we get to chapter 11 there.